In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. Not during World War II, not during the Korean War, but during 13 days that unfolded quietly through letters, miscalculations, radar signals, and decisions made under extreme pressure. At one point, a US spy plane was shot down over Cuba. At another, an American aircraft accidentally entered Soviet airspace, nearly triggering a military response. And deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo prepared to launch, believing that war may have already begun. 3 separate incidents, one single day, October 27th, 1962. Later, it would be called Black Saturday. The frightening part is not just how close the world came to nuclear destruction, it is how easily it could have happened. Because the survival of millions did not depend solely on presidents or generals, it depended on hesitation, on doubt, on one man refusing to turn a key. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the day it almost turned nuclear. Act 1. The world holds its breath. When the photographs arrived in Washington on October 16, 1962, they were placed on a light table inside a secure CIA briefing room. Grainy black and white images taken from high altitude showed long cylindrical shapes positioned beside newly constructed launch sites. Analysts studied the shadows, measured distances, and compared the structures to known Soviet missile designs. Their conclusion was unmistakable. The Soviet Union was building nuclear missile bases in Cuba. Within hours, President John F. Kennedy was informed. The discovery fundamentally changed the strategic landscape of the Cold War. Medium-range ballistic missiles stationed in Cuba could reach much of the eastern United States in a matter of minutes. Warning times would shrink dramatically. The balance of deterrence, already fragile, was now under direct strain. The missiles had not appeared overnight. For months, tensions between Washington and Moscow had been intensifying. The previous year, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion had embarrassed the United States and strengthened the alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Cuban leader Fidel Castro feared another American attempt to overthrow his government. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity to both protect Cuba and counter American missiles already positioned in Turkey. From Khrushchev's perspective, the deployment was a strategic correction. From Kennedy's perspective, it was an unacceptable escalation. The president quickly assembled a small group of advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. Over the next several days, they debated possible responses. Some argued for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Others warned that such an attack could kill Soviet personnel and trigger a wider war. Every option carried risk. An invasion of Cuba might remove the missiles, but it could also provoke Soviet retaliation in Europe, particularly in Berlin. Doing nothing, however, would signal weakness and permanently alter the balance of power. After days of tense discussion, Kennedy chose a middle course, a naval blockade, carefully described as a quarantine, to avoid the legal definition of an act of war. American warships were ordered to form a defensive perimeter around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet military shipments from arriving. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on live television. He revealed the existence of the missile sites and announced the quarantine. Across the United States, millions watched in silence. For many Americans, it was the first time they fully confronted the reality that nuclear war was no longer abstract, it was measurable in miles. As US forces moved to higher states of readiness, Soviet ships continued their approach toward the blockade line. Nuclear bombers were dispersed to airfields across the country. Submarines repositioned. Both sides prepared for the possibility that miscalculation, not intention, might decide events. For the next several days, the world existed in suspended tension. Messages passed slowly between Washington and Moscow. Public statements were measured, but behind closed doors, the pressure intensified. Military commanders operated under strict rules of engagement, yet the margin for error grew thinner by the hour. By the morning of October 27th, the crisis had entered its most dangerous phase. What neither government fully understood was that events were already slipping beyond careful diplomatic control. And before the day ended, the world would come closer to nuclear war than anyone in those meeting rooms had intended. Act 2. The 13 Days. After President Kennedy announced the naval quarantine on October 22, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis entered a new and uncertain phase. The United States had publicly revealed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and the world was now watching how Moscow would respond. The quarantine line was set roughly 500 miles from the Cuban coast. American naval vessels, including aircraft carriers and destroyers, took their positions across the Atlantic. Their orders were clear: stop and inspect Soviet ships suspected of carrying military equipment to Cuba. If necessary, turn them back. The situation was delicate. A blockade, under international law, could be interpreted as an act of war. That is why the White House carefully used the term quarantine. The wording mattered. Every phrase, every signal was calculated to avoid automatic escalation. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev initially condemned the American action as aggression. Soviet ships were already en route to Cuba. Some carried military cargo, others were transporting oil and industrial supplies. The key question was whether they would challenge the quarantine line or change course. On October 24th, American radar operators tracked Soviet vessels as they approached the perimeter. In Washington, officials waited for confirmation. If Soviet ships attempted to break through, US naval forces would have to act. A direct confrontation between American and Soviet personnel could trigger rapid escalation. Then, unexpectedly, several Soviet ships slowed down. Some stopped, others turned around. For the moment, a naval clash had been avoided, but the crisis was far from over. While the world focused on the blockade, construction continued at the missile sites in Cuba. Intelligence reports indicated that launch preparations were advancing. Some missile systems were becoming operational. The window for a clean military strike, if one were to be ordered, was narrowing. Inside the executive committee, debate intensified. Airstrikes remained an option. A full-scale invasion of Cuba was still under consideration. Military leaders argued that delay only strengthened the Soviet position. Civilian advisors warned that any attack on Cuba could lead to Soviet retaliation in Berlin or elsewhere in Europe. At the same time, diplomatic messages began moving between Washington and Moscow. Communication was slow, often taking many hours to encode, transmit, decode, and interpret. Misunderstandings were possible at every stage. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter to President John F. Kennedy. In it, he proposed a solution. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. The letter appeared conciliatory. It suggested that a peaceful resolution might still be possible. The following day, a second message arrived from Moscow. This one was more formal and more demanding. In addition to a non-invasion pledge, the Soviet Union now required the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The tone had shifted. It was unclear whether the two letters reflected confusion within the Soviet leadership or a deliberate negotiation strategy. As October 27th approached, uncertainty deepened. Military forces on both sides remained at high alert. Strategic Air Command in the United States moved to DEFCON 2, one step below full nuclear war readiness. It was the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. Publicly, leaders spoke cautiously. Privately, the margin for error was shrinking. The crisis was no longer defined solely by planned strategies. It was increasingly shaped by events that could spiral beyond political control. And on the morning of October 27th, those events began to unfold. Act 3. Black Saturday. October 27th, 1962. Later, it would be remembered as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. By this point, both superpowers were operating under extreme pressure. American forces remained at DEFCON 2. Strategic bombers were airborne, some carrying nuclear weapons. Soviet troops in Cuba were on alert. Command structures were tense, layered, and vulnerable to misunderstanding. The first crisis of the day began in the skies over Cuba. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, was conducting a routine surveillance mission over the island. Its purpose was straightforward: photograph missile sites and assess their operational status. But this time, the mission did not end routinely. Soviet surface-to-air missile forces in Cuba launched an SA-2 missile. The aircraft was struck and destroyed. Major Anderson was killed. In Washington, the news arrived quickly. The shootdown represented a direct Soviet attack on an American aircraft. For many military leaders, it was the trigger they had anticipated. Airstrikes against Cuban missile sites, they argued, were now justified. Inside the White House, the atmosphere shifted. The president and his advisors understood that retaliation could lead to rapid escalation. If the United States attacked Soviet positions in Cuba, Soviet forces might respond not only in the Caribbean but also in Europe, especially in Berlin, where tensions had already been high since the construction of the Berlin Wall. But the day's dangers were not confined to Cuba. Almost simultaneously, a second U-2 aircraft, flying near the Arctic Circle on a routine mission to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, strayed into Soviet airspace. The cause was likely navigational error, possibly influenced by unusual auroral activity interfering with instruments. Soviet fighter jets scrambled to intercept. American fighter aircraft, some armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles, were dispatched to protect the lost U-2 and escort it back to safety. For a brief period, Armed aircraft from both sides were maneuvering in proximity under conditions of high alert. A single misinterpreted move could have led to direct combat between nuclear-armed powers. The U-2 eventually exited Soviet airspace without being shot down, but the margin had been thin. Back in Washington, President John F. Kennedy faced a critical decision. Military advisors pressed for action in response to the shootdown over Cuba. Some argued that failing to respond would weaken American credibility. Others warned that escalation could quickly move beyond anyone's control. Kennedy chose restraint. No immediate retaliatory strike would be launched. Instead, diplomatic channels remained open. The administration would respond to the earlier, more conciliatory letter from Nikita Khrushchev, while quietly exploring a possible solution involving American missiles in Turkey. But even as these discussions continued in Washington and Moscow, another crisis was unfolding, one that neither leadership fully understood at the time. Deep beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine was being forced upward by American naval forces. And on board that submarine was a nuclear weapon. The events of Black Saturday were not over. In fact, the most dangerous moment of the entire crisis was still approaching. Act 4, the submarine B-59. While leaders in Washington and Moscow debated letters and military options, a separate confrontation was unfolding beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. 4 Soviet submarines had been deployed toward the Caribbean as part of the broader operation supporting the missile installations in Cuba. One of them was B-59, a diesel-electric submarine operating under difficult conditions. Unlike modern nuclear submarines, B-59 required periodic servicing to recharge its batteries. By late October, it had been submerged for extended periods while attempting to avoid detection by American naval forces enforcing the quarantine. Inside the submarine, conditions were deteriorating. The tropical waters were warm, ventilation was limited, and carbon dioxide levels were rising. Communication with Moscow had become sporadic. The crew had little reliable information about events above the surface. On October 27th, American destroyers detected B-59 near the quarantine line. Following established procedures, they began dropping small practice depth charges, signaling devices intended to force the submarine to surface. The intention was not to destroy the vessel, but the Soviet crew did not know that. Inside B-59, the explosions were felt as violent shocks against the hull. To those on board, it could reasonably appear that war had begun. What the American Navy did not know was that B-59 was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The weapon had a yield comparable to the atomic bomb used at Hiroshima. If launched against the surrounding US fleet, it would almost certainly have triggered immediate nuclear retaliation. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed they were under direct attack. Cut off from reliable communication and enduring extreme physical stress, he reportedly concluded that the United States might already have initiated war. Under Soviet protocol, the nuclear torpedo could be launched only with the agreement of 3 senior officers on board. The captain agreed. The political officer agreed. The third officer was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov held a unique position. In addition to serving as second-in-command on B-59, he was also the flotilla commander of the submarine group, giving him authority that exceeded that of the captain in certain circumstances. As tensions rose inside the control room, the decision was debated. The crew was exhausted. Temperatures inside the submarine were reportedly above 40 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide levels were affecting concentration and judgment. The situation felt immediate and existential. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. Instead, he argued that they should surface and await further instructions. It was not a dramatic public act. There were no speeches, no audience, no global awareness of the moment. It was a discussion in a confined metal hull under pressure with incomplete information. Eventually, the captain relented. B-59 surfaced. American ships surrounded the submarine but did not attack. The confrontation ended without further escalation. The submarine later withdrew. At the time, neither President John F. Kennedy nor Premier Nikita Khrushchev fully understood how close events had come to crossing a nuclear threshold. Only years later would the details of the submarine incident become widely known. On Black Saturday, nuclear war was not avoided solely by strategy or diplomacy. It was avoided because one officer chose caution over assumption, and the crisis was still not entirely resolved. Act 5. The Secret Deal. By the evening of October 27, 1962, both Washington and Moscow understood that the crisis could not continue much longer. Military forces were stretched to their highest states of readiness, communication was strained, and the risk of accidental escalation had become dangerously real. Earlier that day, 2 very different letters from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had arrived in Washington. The first letter, sent on October 26th, was personal in tone. Khrushchev proposed that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. The message suggested a path toward de-escalation without public humiliation for either side. The second letter, delivered on October 27th, was more formal and more demanding. It added a new condition, the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These missiles, stationed near Soviet borders, had long been a source of tension in Moscow. The shift in tone created confusion. It was unclear whether the second message reflected internal debate within the Soviet leadership or a calculated escalation in negotiations. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy and his advisors faced a complex decision. Publicly agreeing to remove missiles from Turkey could appear as a concession under pressure, potentially weakening NATO alliances. Privately rejecting the proposal risked prolonging the crisis. After intense discussion, a strategy emerged. The United States would publicly respond only to the first letter, accepting the proposal not to invade Cuba in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles. At the same time, a separate, confidential message would be delivered through back-channel diplomacy. The message was clear. The United States was prepared to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but only under strict conditions. The arrangement would remain secret. The removal would occur within a few months, and it would not be publicly linked to the Cuban settlement. This compromise allowed both leaders to claim a form of victory. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and withdraw its missiles from Cuba. The message was broadcast publicly over Radio Moscow. The immediate crisis was over. American naval forces maintained the quarantine until the missile sites were verified as dismantled. United Nations observers played a role in confirming the withdrawal. Over the following weeks, Soviet ships transported missiles and equipment back across the Atlantic. Quietly, and without public announcement, the United States later removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. At the time, few outside a small circle of officials understood the full scope of the agreement. The public narrative framed the outcome as a firm American stance leading to Soviet retreat. The private reality was more complex. Compromise had prevented catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with victory, but with mutual restraint. Yet the events of October 27 had revealed something unsettling. The world had not come close to nuclear war solely because leaders intended it. It had come close because systems were fragile, communication was slow, and individual decisions carried enormous weight. The crisis was resolved, but the lesson was unmistakable. The nuclear age had entered a new phase, one in which survival depended as much on caution as on power. Act 6. What almost happened. When the Cuban Missile Crisis formally ended on October 28, 1962, the world exhaled. Newspapers reported that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States lifted the naval quarantine. Political leaders on both sides presented the outcome as firm but measured diplomacy. But what was not immediately understood, not by the public and not even by many officials at the time, was how close events had come to escaping control. On October 27th alone, 3 separate incidents had carried the potential to trigger nuclear war. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had been shot down over Cuba, killing Major Rudolph Anderson. Military commanders urged retaliation. The president chose restraint. Another U-2 aircraft had accidentally entered Soviet airspace near the Arctic, prompting interceptor jets to scramble. American fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles were launched in response. The situation resolved without engagement, but only narrowly. And beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the Soviet submarine B-59, armed with a nuclear torpedo, had nearly launched its weapon after believing it was under attack. The launch required agreement from 3 officers. 2 consented. Vasily Arkhipov did not. Each of these events unfolded under conditions of incomplete information, stress, and technical limitation. Decisions were made without full awareness of what was happening elsewhere. Communication between Washington and Moscow relied on encoded messages that could take hours to deliver and interpret. The crisis demonstrated that nuclear war did not require deliberate aggression. It could emerge from miscalculation, misinterpretation, or mechanical error. At the height of the standoff, the United States had moved to DEFCON 2, the highest level of nuclear readiness ever reached in its history. Strategic bombers were airborne. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were prepared for launch. Soviet forces maintained comparable levels of alert. Had nuclear war begun in 1962, the immediate destruction would have been immense. Major cities in North America, Europe, and the Soviet Union would likely have been targeted. Casualty estimates vary, but tens of millions could have died within days. Long-term consequences, radioactive fallout, economic collapse, potential global famine would have reshaped civilization. The crisis forced both superpowers to confront a reality that had previously been theoretical. The systems designed to prevent nuclear war were fragile. In the months that followed, changes were implemented. A direct communication link, later known as the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to reduce delays in future crises. In 1963, the two nations signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, restricting certain forms of nuclear weapons testing. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union did not end. The Cold War continued for decades. Nuclear arsenals expanded before they eventually began to decline. But after October 1962, both sides possessed a clearer understanding of the risks embedded in their own strategies. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not become nuclear war. Not because the world was stable, not because the systems were flawless, but because, at several critical moments, individuals chose caution over impulse. History often records victories and defeats. October 1962 was neither. It was a warning. And for 13 days, humanity stood closer to self-destruction than at any time before or since. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. 13 days of uncertainty. 13 days of measured words and restrained actions. 13 days in which the survival of millions depended on judgment under pressure. When it ended, there were no celebrations. There was relief. But there was also recognition. The nuclear age had revealed its true nature. Power alone could not guarantee safety. Strength alone could not prevent catastrophe. Survival required communication, patience, and at times, restraint. In the years that followed, new safeguards were introduced. Direct communication lines were established. Arms control agreements were negotiated. Both superpowers adjusted their strategies, but the weapons never disappeared. The world moved forward, still armed, still cautious, still aware of what had almost happened. October 1962 remains a reminder that history does not always turn on grand speeches or dramatic victories. Sometimes it turns quietly, in a briefing room, in a cockpit, or deep beneath the surface of the ocean. And sometimes it turns because someone hesitates. If you found this story valuable, consider subscribing. There are many moments in history where the outcome was not inevitable, and we will continue exploring them, because understanding the past is one of the few ways we reduce the risk of repeating it.